And I really do feel like that was something that I learned in the first year as a manager at SpaceX and basically kept with me, is the ability to understand like the 80/20, like how much time do I have to put in to understand like 80% of the thing.
I work with a lot of very technical companies, and the managers of those companies are required to make very technical decisions. So I am often confronted with this question of how technical does a manager need to be? As a manager, how do you stay connected to the technical side of the team you are leading without getting, completely disconnected with the management tasks that you also have to accomplish? This is a really difficult balance that I think a lot of trouble have a hard time finding. And so that's why I was really excited to have today's guest on, Matt Mueller. Matt is a SpaceX veteran who is now co-founder of a company called Glīd, which is building the very first industry solution for road to rail transportation. In the discussion today, we talk about a lot of things. We focus on Matt's very first experiences as a supervisor at Honeywell, where he had to lead a team of 45 technicians, all with decades more experience than he had. We also talk about the critical importance of understanding the context of your team and your leadership in order to make sure your leadership approach is correct. And finally, we dive into this critical question of how do you stay technical as a manager without forgetting about your manager responsibilities. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind you that if this is your first time listening to the show, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you happen to be someone who's responsible for leadership development in your organization, I would love to talk to you. Please reach out to me at matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can figure out how to make the managers in your organization better. With that, let's get into the discussion with Matt Mueller. Matt, welcome to the Leadership Launchpad. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you here today. We worked together for a little while, in passing when we were at SpaceX. So when I started this podcast, you were definitely one of the top names of somebody I wanted to have on, and I'm so glad we got reconnected recently. In a minute, we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of what you're working on right now, but I'd actually love to start back kind of in the beginning of your time as as an engineer and as a leader. What was your first experience as a leader?
So my first experience was when I was 23 years old. I was working at Honeywell Aerospace, a couple years out of college, and took over large technician team during a factory transition. So machine shops, but also clean and shop team and a lot of special processing around rotating components for aircraft engines at Honeywell. And I had a team up to about 45 team members at a pretty young age. So it was definitely thrown into the fire pretty early on.
Wow. Yeah, that is definitely thrown into the fire. Did they have a program there to help you? How did you figure out what it meant to lead that large of a group of people?
No, there was no formal structure in place. I think generally speaking, you would have that, but I was at a site at the engines facility near the Sky Harbor Airport that was in the middle of a factory transition to Chihuahua, Mexico, back in 2009, 2010. And so it was really just they were looking for warm bodies to put into places while we're going through a transition. So it was not an ideal place to learn leadership, but it was an incredible opportunity to get humbled by the opportunity for sure.
Yeah. Anything stand out as like some of the early lessons that you had to learn in the fire?
The primary one was, the average age of the employees I was leading was probably about 55, and I think I said 23. I was really 25 years old. So you're really leading people who've been doing their jobs for 30 years. And it's a very humbling experience. I think you shift away from whatever your vision is for the group to, I'm just going to go learn their jobs and really connect with them individually, because there's a huge hill to climb there when you're a far junior team member leading somebody who's been around 30, 40 years. They've forgotten more
Yeah.
about the job than I ever hoped to know. And so I think it was, in one way, it was a very, not an ideal forced leadership position that I would recommend for aspiring leaders. On the other hand, it really taught me the importance of investing that time in developing personal relationships with the team members that you lead, especially when you're inheriting a team.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine kind of like you said, it's probably not ideal, but it was almost such an extreme situation, I'm sure. They're probably, because I think a lot of new leaders, their tendency is to be the leader and like they're the ones that have the answers. They're the ones who are like, hey, what, they try to rely on their expertise to lead, whereas you right from the get-go kind of knew you couldn't do that. And so probably the only thing that you could fall back on was building of relationships. So I don't know if the extreme situation kind of forced you into a particular path that probably other people, it takes them a long time to realize the importance of those connections simply because they try to do other things where those other things probably weren't an option for you, really.
Yeah, no, in many ways, I was able to very efficiently down select the things I thought I could accomplish in a 6-month period, which is about
Yeah.
how long I was in that role until the factory shut down. And then I transitioned over to a supervisor role at the Torrance site and stayed in that role for a couple of years. But it really taught me that, like, you're not going to go here and transform the team. You're not going to, drive improvements in delivery year over year if you're only there 6 months. You're really just overseeing a transition and making sure the wheels stay on. And so ultimately, it was developing those relationships, making sure morale was reasonable, as good as it could be given the circumstances, and making sure that you made deliveries. And so, yeah, you're not going to be an expert in any particular process when you're leading a 40-person team there. So from that respect, I was able to set realistic expectations, or it forced you to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. After there, when you came to SpaceX, I know one of the things that we briefly talked about before the show is you train. So first you were an individual contributor and then became a people manager again. But one of the big changes that happened is you went from leading technicians to leading engineers. And I always find it really interesting in our kind of space of, like the manufacturing and aerospace, how there's so many mixes of people where, and sometimes engineers are leading engineers, sometimes you're leading technicians, sometimes you're leading both. What are some of the differences that you saw in leading kind of those different populations of people?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I benefited from going into that role, just kind of making the transition between the point that we just made, is that I was given the opportunity to be in an IC role in the job that I was going to lead, which I'd never been, a machinist or a technician before I took that supervisor role. And so I was able to go in with a fresh outlook and say, okay, I got humbled by that, shop floor leadership role. I really want to understand everything there is to know about this engineering role and be the best on my team, right? That was my first goal. And so I was able to kind of wipe the slate clean, focus on that. And when the time came, walked into a lead role and then became a manager role 6 months after that.
Yeah.
And so that benefited me going into it. Was I knew more than the team members I led, where it was the other way around in my previous role. In terms of the differences between technicians and engineers, I think with engineers, obviously there's a bit more of at least with the caliber of engineers we were hiring, there was more of a lot of them were very focused on climbing the ladder in one way or another. They didn't quite know what that meant coming out of college, but a lot of them wanted to eventually enter leadership roles or technical expertise roles. And so you could throw stuff at them and there would be longer periods between when you had to touch base on things getting completed. Like, you knew that tasks could get completed, but you had to focus more on the strategy and outlook and impact of those things. So you had to think a lot more critically through, is the thing that they're working on important, and change their perspective, as opposed to, with technicians, a lot of it is making sure they learn hard skill sets, remain disciplined, and complete a task in a timely manner. With engineers, there's a strategy component too that doesn't exist as much when you're doing shop floor type work. It's just a difference in the nature of the work. And so I had to think about things like, corporate goals. Like, what was SpaceX trying to accomplish at that point in time? Well, they were trying to hit 40 rockets a year, right? And so previously, quality assurance type roles. We called it product validation. It became build reliability eventually. There's all the same kind of concept where a lot of it is risk buy down and defect reduction, where kind of like the organization's targets. But there had to be a component or an understanding about the vehicle rate, right? So that's an example of like a perspective I would have to drive to my engineers, that it's not just about making sure that an error and an issue ticket's not made or that you catch things during an EM review. It's also the projects that you take on have to enable faster and more efficient rocket builds as well. And so kind of weaving in those goals into their day-to-day work is not just coaching them on or giving them direct feedback on the project selection. It's changing their mindset so that they can seek those opportunities without your intervention. So there's a much more strategic component to your involvement in their work.
Yeah, interesting. It's interesting though, because you mentioned how helpful it was to get a little bit more time in the role, understanding of the role itself before you kind of led that role, which is very different from your first experience. I kind of said how I imagined that in that first role, like very clearly, you couldn't lead by example or lead by expertise, if you will, because you didn't have that expertise. What else did you learn about leadership because of this new role? Or like, what else did you learn about your style of leadership or your preferred style of leadership, I suppose, because you now had a little bit more of that background and you could, if you wanted to, choose to lean on the expertise side a little bit. Did that, I don't know, change how you led at all?
I don't think it changed how I led too much. It more so just changed the ability that I was able to dig into and provide adequate technical steering on day-to-day activity and more strategic efforts. So I still think I came at it from a perspective of being an empathetic leader, but there were just different dynamics in the nature of this job than in the previous supervisory roles. And I think there's also, a corporate culture change too. Like SpaceX was an evolving culture when I was going into it. These jobs and these teams were changing constantly. Like we had development programs where manufacturing engineer would roll up into design and then it would be passed back off to production. And you had to be very nimble in terms of like what your group's involvement was and what you meant as a piece of that like SpaceX operation. Whereas, we're working in a Fortune 100 company with a product line that hasn't changed in 20 years. You're kind of just executing to a procedure. There's not a whole lot of cultural appetite for change. And so there was just less of a push. I won't say there's less opportunity for improvement, but the way you went about it was far more political. And so I think it changed the way that you operated as a team member and as a leader, but it didn't change like how you approached your job with your employees, if that makes sense.
It 100% does. And I think what I'm hearing from both of those stories for any leader, and especially a new leader, is just how important it is to understand kind of the context around the team that you are leading, whether that's understanding the context of the kinds of jobs they're doing, the type of people they are, or the type of organization that you are in. It's not that any one of them are right or wrong, or we should all try to be one thing, but all of those different pieces of context have to impact the way you lead if you want to be able to lead effectively. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. And I think it was like one of the changes that was very challenging at SpaceX was how fast it changed, right? And how high the bar was set. But also, I think one thing that made it really easy was that it was a very mission-driven culture. It was a very dedicated culture. And so even though you had points of friction in a fast-changing environment where you had to think on the fly, in most cases, that was actually more invigorating and brought out better results in people too. Yeah. So I think even though people think, fast-changing can be too fast at times, like I think at least in my experience, that brought more engagement and better problem solving. Yeah.
I think I always say this a lot when I think back to my time in the military, because I was in the military in the flying part of the military and the flying culture, which is a very operational culture. And when I first came to SpaceX, it was at a time where SpaceX was just finishing up lots of disagreements, we'll say, with the U.S. Air Force and lots of cultural clashes with the U.S. Air Force. And honestly, I was really confused when I first joined because I was used to a flying culture that felt exactly the same in many ways as a SpaceX culture. It was a very mission driven, get it done. You're out on the road. You get changed of where you're going. Oh, a part broke. Let's get a waiver to that part. It was all about problem solving, like you're saying. And that drove, you would almost, when you're out on a Coronet flying around the Pacific, constantly having to look at the minimum equipment list and figure out if you can go. And then, the nature of our mission has changed, like you were way more engaged doing that than if you were out deployed to the desert where just every day you're doing the same thing, your fuel load's the same, you're going to the same place. And so it totally makes sense to me that rapid pace of change and higher bar, as you're saying, is what drives engagement in the right culture, as long as you have that mission-driven culture, rather than breaking people down because they get frustrated or something like that. There's certainly a balance there, but I definitely can see what you're saying of those kinds of changes can drive the people if the culture is correct. From any particular things that you learned worked really well? Were there any particular things that you learned worked really well in those times of high change? Because I imagine even though it drives a lot of focus, I got to believe at some point people would get frustrated at different stages.
Yeah.
Like how did you work to handle that?
I mean, to use these two examples as foils of one another, both
Sure.
of them were dynamic for very different reasons. In the Honeywell example, the way I drove engagement was on a personal level. Like when you get to know people and
Yeah.
you understand, like everyone there had worked there for 40 years. They were very dedicated to their craft. They loved their job. Many of them were moving on to existing Honeywell sites, and some of them were taking retirement packages, right? But in many ways, they define themselves by their work. And I think when you're at that age too, it's so ingrained in you that this is part of who you are. When you connect on that level, it brought the results needed to get through a tough time. You couldn't walk in and say, well, at Honeywell, this is our mission, when the company is actively trying to get rid of your job, right? Like you can't really go in with that mindset and expect to get good results. The opposite is true at SpaceX, right? Like everyone knew what the mission was. Everyone was fired up about it. It was really just taking alignment on what the corporate priorities were at that point in time and dealing with some blowback at times, right? Like there are times where it's like Falcon's most important, Dragon's not, and then it would flip depending on the program, or like then we'd have an anomaly in Falcon and be all hands on deck. And it's teaching a like humble flexibility in people that like this is part of the excitement of the role and not a deterrent to what they're trying to accomplish. So both of them presented different challenges. Both of them presented different approaches. But at the end of the day, it's how do you drive engagement is absolutely critical on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I love that. Totally agree. And now you're doing something. You've done a few things in SpaceX, but now you have something new. You're working on a new startup. What can you tell us about what you're working on right now?
Yeah, so right now we actually are closing out a pre-seed round at Glīd. Glīd is a first mile delivery startup focusing on dual modal transport. So the way to look at it is accessing, I'll say that the most efficient form of freight transportation that we have today is rail. But accessing rail is incredibly cumbersome and difficult. It can take 6 unique steps, 20 workers, and 6 pieces of CapEx, hoists, lifts, trains, flatbed trucks, the works, to get a payload, whether it's a standard container or a dump truck full of aggregate, from a road-based location to the first transload station, right?
Yeah.
At Glīd, we're trying to reduce that to 1 worker using 1 vehicle with 1 operation. And so you can cut down, the case studies that we've done for ports of entry, for instance, you can cut down a lead time that's traditionally 2 to 3 weeks down to 24 hours, right? You can reduce costs by 90% using dual modal technology. Today they're called high rail vehicles. So high rail vehicles are vehicles that can drive on road and rail. Picture, an F650 like super diesel with rail kit on it, right? But you're picturing something that's kind of using 20th century technology. The wheels go down with a manual crank. There's like a pulley system that can pull your container onto your truck, but it requires the driver to get out of the cockpit, which isn't the safest location.
Sure.
And so generally it's used today to move equipment and workers, but it's not used as primary freight. And so we want to change that with homegrown designs that we design and build these vehicles, and then we go operate them for customers. So we're an
Yeah,
asset-based freight logistics provider.
got it. I feel humbled because having lived where I was like overlooking the whole port of Long Beach for 8 years, I don't think I ever really thought of that transition as being one of the, one of the points of one of the constricting points in the whole supply chain. That's really interesting. I can't believe I never really realized just how hard that transition is, and it makes sense that, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of containers stacked up down there, and so any ability to transition them from one mode of transport to the other faster, I gotta believe would be huge. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
I
How,
mean,
and
picture like
going
there's
well
a
so
number of
far?
economists that have pegged that there's different numbers being thrown out that 60% of our
Yeah,
inflation was caused by supply demand
yeah,
whiplash due to COVID.
yeah,
And
yeah.
about two-thirds of the goods that come into the U.S. from Southeast Asia go through two ports, Port of LA and Port of Long Beach. And so streamlining that operation as best as possible helps, reduce some of that supply demand whiplash. But there's also a lot of different, you could manage, higher inspection rates for human trafficking. There's a lot of options you get into when you can streamline first mile delivery to that degree. So we're exploring
Awesome.
a lot of interesting opportunities on that front.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. And so now you're starting your own company, which means you get a much bigger say into the culture, into what leadership means. And so now we get to actually the number one reason why I wanted to talk to you, because we had touched on this topic a few weeks ago when we connected on the phone. One of the things that always make, I always question, or I always wonder about, is as you shift from being an engineer or a technical expert into being a leader, how technical do you need to become? Because there's kind of two sides of the coin. Like, I've actually talked to people who think the fact that, so many managers these days are both people managers and still individual contributors. They think that is the key problem with leadership today, in that we're splitting duties. We're not allowing them to be just a manager. And so that's why they're struggling. I talk to other people. I think I'm more in the camp of, especially in, these kinds of companies, if leadership doesn't have a really firm connection to the technical realities, how are they going to be able to make decisions? So as you sit, you're starting to, you're building your own company, you're going to have much more say into what it means to be a leader. I guess I'll start with asking the question of, do you think it's a bad idea, or where do you stand on those two sides of, can you be just a manager, or do you need to be a manager and, and still highly technically competent?
Yeah, I mean, my short answer is I think you have to be competent in both. It's really hard I would say it's a prerequisite to be at least highly strong in the discipline of the team members that you seek to oversee, right?
Yeah.
The larger the organization you take, the less you're going to be an expert of that. And you can't get too bogged
Yep.
down if you're leading 500 people with, can I weld as well as my welders, right? But
Yeah.
at the same
Yeah.
point, you have to raise the floor in a lot of cases, and at least go out and stay in tune with what their challenges are. When you're leading smaller engineering teams, especially in highly technical fields like aerospace, for instance, it's critical that you stay highly technical, because you're making very critical business decisions with regards to risk and product vision that have major implications for the company direction. And as a company becomes more stable and scales, maybe there's less of a need for that outside of staying in tune with what the day-to-day challenges for your employees are, and finding those strategic projects to continuously improve and drive costs out of the business. So it really depends on the type of role and company. But in short, if you're working at like highly technical, disruptive companies, you have to be able to balance both. And I think you'll find like different messaging, right? Like you'll find people, leaders in tech, who have been strongly on the managerial front for some time, work through highly
Yeah.
technical people, and have an ability to effectively communicate well, to hold people accountable, and do all the like people leadership piece. And maybe they're not as technical, but they're able to accomplish that and play to their strengths. And then you have people who are more on the product visionary front, where like you're leading a really, a really challenging design problem, right? And you really need to stay in tune with all major changes that are associated with this, because your strengths are highly technical as well. I think if you're deficient in any one of those two areas, it can be a problem, but to what degree that is very dependent on the role.
That makes sense. I suppose, kind of as I'm listening to your answer, I think it also is just essential that wherever your strength lies, you at least have a respect for the other side. You know, if your strength is in the technical side, you need to at least have a respect for the importance of more of the managerial side, and not believe it's not important. Just as much as if your strength is on the managerial side, you need to have a respect for the technical side and know that like you have a limitation there and need to rely on some other people rather than just think that it's not important. For you, when you moved, and probably this has mainly happened at SpaceX, like when you made that transition into people management and as you moved up, how did you personally make sure that you were staying like connected enough to the technical realities so that you could make those decisions and you didn't just get consumed by manager responsibilities?
So one thing is like streamlining communication. I think we had a really effective risk escalation process that we rolled out when we built the build reliability organization, as well as a way to tag tickets and prescribe risk. So we had a way to funnel the most important information so that managers were deeply in tune with what the most technical, like challenging technical problems were, or the most impactful ones were. And so you have to budget at least a quarter of your time to understanding those, like, innately. On top of that, there are points where you go through team disruption and points where you're at team stability, right? Like, and I think that's, you know, at SpaceX, I always felt like that was directly tied to whether you were fully staffed or not. In build reliability, if you're a couple people down, it really shows. And that forces you as a way to kind of take some of the burden off your team. If you know that, you know, an employee's not going to start for 3 months, I would grab a work center for 3 months and handle those tickets and EMs and, you know, use that as an opportunity to learn a new application or learn a specific change and understand the pain points that people brought in. And so there's points of disruption where you're forced into that case where it becomes a net positive because you pull out a strategic opportunity or you get a perspective out of it that like, hey, maybe my perception of this manufacturing team wasn't exactly right. Maybe they have some challenges I didn't think they have, or maybe the other way around. Maybe they're actually handling their challenges well. And we're just, you know, dealt a bad hand from, you know, a couple underperforming suppliers or something. And so I found it to be very effective to making sure it was a good bias check on me, a good way to also show my team that I'm willing to roll up my sleeves, and a way to stay in tune with both the like systems technical side as well as the product.
Yeah. I think, that's how I usually describe it often is it's really important to be willing and able to get in the trenches in those moments where you can really help out your team, but then not get stuck there. So not create a situation where you're already there. Was that ever a challenge to make sure that you don't just fall into only doing that kind of work? I know, again, when I was in the military, a phrase that we always used is that everyone's trying to do their last job, where, you know, a squadron commander would get good at being a squadron commander and then they would leave because they get promoted every 2 years. You only hold that role for 2 years. And so then they become a group commander. And the first thing they do as a group commander is they're trying to be a squadron commander. And then if they get promoted to wing commander, the first thing they're trying to do is try to be a group commander because they like know that last job. Did you ever have to make sure to remind yourself, this isn't my job anymore, like this is my job, and like pull yourself out of that? Or was that pretty easy to do?
In some ways, I would say more so in the first, you know, year of the role. It was interesting because, you know, at my supervisory role, I had to be broad because I had so much area to cover and I knew there was an end date to that role. So it was like kind of unique in the sense that there was no incentive to become an expert in any of this. It was like manage the risk of the day, keep morale high and move on, right? At SpaceX, it was kind of the opposite where there was such an emphasis on technical skills development. And I put such an importance on that for my first couple of years when I was in engineering and even while I was a lead, because I only had an employee or two before I stepped into my manager role, to where, you know, I kind of immersed myself in the new product areas early on as a manager so that I could understand the technical piece first and foremost. But for that first
Mm-hmm.
6 months, I wasn't giving a ton of attention. I can remember this to some of the lower risk work centers. The way I handled that was obviously through relationship building with those team members. But I think early on there were points where my boss would encourage me to kind of look broader, or trust that someone's going to deliver something on a key strategic initiative in this new project, and trust that even though I don't know all the answers in real time, that's fine. I'll go find them. So I had to kind of like relearn that from my supervisory days. After that, it
Mm-hmm.
was more, once you understood it, it became like muscle memory. And I really do feel like that was something that I learned in the first year as a manager at SpaceX and basically kept with me, is the ability to understand like the 80-20, like how much time do I have to put in to understand like 80% of the thing. And then if I
Yeah.
needed to, grab a detail or something, on the periphery, that I could go find that information. So being able to differentiate, like going and solving a problem and being able to coach engineers to go solve a problem versus knowing everything. Like your goal as a manager shouldn't
Yeah.
be to be a knowledge center. It should be
Yeah.
to go solve problems efficiently and the most critical problems in the business.
Yeah. I love how you put that 80-20, because I've found, in my time in talent development and learning and thinking about how people learn, there's just such an immense curve of the amount of energy it takes to get incrementally better at a thing. So if you think of any skill and put everybody on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is nothing about this skill, and 10, you're the best person in the world at this skill. To me, it feels like for most things, to get to a 7 or an 8 is actually pretty easy. Like it just takes work. You just put in, you give it some focus for a few days or a couple weeks, and you can really quickly upskill your knowledge in any field. But then it's that going from 8 to 10 where it's like, oh no, this takes a lifetime. And it feels like, yeah, there can't, the tricky part, which I'm sure is the muscle memory that you talk about, is figuring out, one, for my role, where on this scale do I need to be, and then what amount of information gets me to that level on the scale. If I need to be an 8, what does that mean for this particular skill? It means I understand the concepts of welding, but I don't need to be able to weld.
Yeah.
Or something like that. I'm sure
I think
that's a tricky thing.
that concept, I think one of the benefits of the nature, the organization that I was leading, is that it's reliability. And so
Yeah.
you have to be 110% sure that the decisions you make are right. You don't have to know everything about the rocket. It's more efficient to learn what your key characteristics and critical items are. Those often don't change across the rocket, even with major design changes, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can go look at a CAD model and probably figure out, through any CDR, and probably figure out, what you've gone through a number of these assessments, probably know 80% of them without even having them identified on the print. Just an understanding function, right? I may not know the design margin on something, but I can go look that up, right?
Yeah.
And maybe in certain areas where you've had, like, there's certain designs like cryogenic pneumatic bottles, for instance, like COPVs, or it was like, all right, you had to understand a little bit more there just because of the nature of the part, right? So certain critical items you'd have to understand more in depth than others. But it really forced you, when you're assessing, like as a build reliability engineer, and you're looking at 200 tickets a day or something, like it really forces you to develop that pattern recognition on technical aspects of the rocket so that you can boil down and use your time most wisely. And so I think that just carried on. That mindset as an engineer carries on as a manager too. It might be a little bit different when you're leading a thermal analysis team, right? Like where you're pushing your engineers to know every minute detail, because there you're driving deviation rationales too. And performing certain risk assessments that like other people in the company can't. So I think that's one thing that kind of helped, at least, is that trait was common and necessary at the engineering role too.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm sure that will only help you, that kind of muscle memory or pattern recognition is only going to help you now as a, leading a company, because I think that's one of the challenges is like the higher you go in an organization or the larger the org chart that spans beneath you, the faster you have to be willing to change those contexts. And obviously the less granular detail you're going to be able to hold on to any given thing. And I think that's one of the key things that I keep hearing come up at a lot of really successful companies is, this came up in, I just finished reading a book about NVIDIA and what their CEO does, and how their CEO seems to be really good at, when there is a kind of like you said, even though when the company is making a decision about going in a new direction, he takes the time to become technically competent in that new direction so that he can help inform that decision. Whereas he's not going to be as technically competent in the things that are maybe more routinous for the organization, or things that they know well, and he can rely more on the decision makers that are below him for those other areas. And so it's just figuring out, again, that level of detail that you need to be given the context, given the nature of the decision.
Absolutely. Yep.
Interesting. Awesome. Well, this has been great. I don't want to take too much of your time. What's next for you at Glīd? Like, what are the next big milestones that you're looking forward to?
So, currently we're clear to build on our first, or actually in process on our first 2 driver vehicles, servicing $250,000 PO up at Taylor Transport, one of our early contracts. And
Awesome.
then we're also in the middle of a prototype build for our first autonomous model. And we're also building a military spec version of that as well. And then lastly, we're through a lot of build right now. We're building our in-house freight brokerage platform called Ezra 1.6. So really heavy into build. All of this is in service of additional funding, but also to service our first paid PO. We also have a partnership with Mendocino Railway, where we're going to be hauling aggregate for them. So,
Wow.
And starting to build more contracts on top of that with partnerships that we built over the last couple of years. So heavy in build, wrapped up our pre-seed round, and it's really exciting. Things are starting to take off. So
That's really exciting. Well, it sounds like you're firing on all cylinders. I look forward to keeping up with it. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here.
thanks, Matt. It was great.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.